Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, there are certain channels that often get requested by you, the viewer, for me to do a reaction to, and some pretty big ones that many people, including myself, are familiar with that I have not yet looked at in a reaction video. Well, today we're going to knock one of those off the list. This is going to be Mark Felton Productions. I've seen a few of his videos on my own over time, but I've never done a reaction to one. So today we're going to look at one of the topics that I find myself intrigued about. I've read several books about this guy. I've got my own thoughts about him, and that is General George S. Patton. So the title of this video is General Patton's Death, Accident or Murder. This is one of those conspiracy theories that people talk about. You guys are always asking me about conspiracy theories and which ones I subscribe to. I, for one, do not believe that there was anything nefarious about Patton's death. I think it was just a freak accident, and it was complications of that freak accident that led to the embolism that killed him. So we'll get into that, I'm sure, as we dive into this story. I'm guessing we're going to get some background as well. So I'll put the link down in the description just in case you haven't seen it, or you want to check out some of Mark Felton Productions' other videos without my commentary. Let's dive in.
It is no exaggeration to say that George S. Patton was one of a handful of generals from World War II whose celebrity has endured for over 70 years.
Yep.
He was probably the most famous American general of the war, or certainly in the top 3 household names.
I was going to say, I think Eisenhower probably is the most famous general of the war, but Eisenhower was really a desk general. He wasn't a battlefield commander. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You need those jobs. And George C. Marshall, same thing, back in Washington.
Alongside General Dwight D. Eisenhower and General Douglas MacArthur. Patton led armies to victory in North Africa, Sicily, and France, Germany, and in the latter campaign, breaking out to race east, ending...
So the one thing I will say with Patton compared to MacArthur, there are some parallels there, but I think in Patton's case that his resume lives up to the hype, whereas I feel like MacArthur has a lot more hype and a lot less bulk on the actual performance. I've never been a big fan of MacArthur, and I've made no secret of that, whereas Patton, I think, like a lot of people, is very complicated. There's a lot of things in his personal life that are not to be admired. And there are even some things about how he handled some things on the battlefield and in his role as a general that should be criticized. But pound for pound, as an army commander, I'm not sure the Allies had a better general.
World War II just inside Czechoslovakia. Honoured and feted by all the Allied nations, many don't know that his final few months were marked by depression, anger, and controversy.
So, if you study George S. Patton, like I said, he's a fascinating character. And I don't know if he's going to get into too much of his backstory, so I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. I'll let this play out a little bit, but if he doesn't get into some Patton's backstory, I definitely want to cover that.
His premature death in December 1945, at the age of only 60, has become the subject of intense speculation. Was it an accident, or was he murdered by a shadowy conspiracy of Allied leaders fed up with Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric and embarrassing faux pas?
See, I always understood the conspiracy to be that the Russians killed him, the Soviets, because of the way he kept talking about them.
Had George S. Patton become a liability instead of the asset he had once been during the fighting in Northwest Europe? Patton was a brilliant, though difficult man who was not slow in stating his opinions about many subjects and whose behavior often led to problems with the Allied authorities.
Great lesson.
And this is a great speech. This was in I think this is the one in Los Angeles. There's one of him on the East Coast speaking and one of him in Los Angeles. This is after VE Day, but before he dies in December. He comes back to Europe and he serves as the military governor of Bavaria, which is the American sector of occupation. And so this is after the end of the war in Europe, but before he goes over as military governor. And it's fascinating because this is from a video that was actually narrated by Ronald Reagan. And first you have Jimmy Doolittle speaking, and then you have Patton come up. And if you've ever seen the movie Patton, you'll notice right away that there's a huge difference in kind of the gruff, gravelly voice of George C. Scott and the kind of high-pitched voice that Patton actually had. But I think as far as personality, Scott really nailed Patton.
The first 4 hours, we passed over a destroyed land, utterly destroyed. You who have not seen it do not know what hell looks like from the top.
From the top, yeah.
That's what Germany looks like. That Austria looks like. That's what any place that the 8th Air Force and the 3rd Army worked on looks like. You must remember this.
This is my favorite part of this speech. You get a little glimpse of the personality that he probably showed to his soldiers a lot more. He keeps it clean, but he makes a comment about destruction that they've caused in Germany, and you see a little smirk afterwards.
That from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed.
There's the smirk. So you could see for a moment there was some contemplation before he started saying this. Like he was thinking, do I really go here? But now that he says it and he gets the reaction that he does, you can see kind of the relief, like, oh, okay, I got away with that one.
The trail of the 3rd Army and the 19th Tactical Air Command and the 8th Air Force is marked by more than 40,000 white crosses.
He first commanded U.S. troops in action during World War II during Operation Torch.
So he's going into Operation Torch in Africa. So just real quick, Patton grows up in a military family. His grandfather was killed in 1864 leading Confederate troops in the Civil War. His great uncle was killed in Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg leading Confederate troops. His great-great-great-grandfather is Hugh Mercer, who was a general under George Washington, who was killed at Princeton in 1777. So long history of military. He first goes to Virginia Military Institute, but that was only a stepping stone for him to get an appointment to West Point. He grew up in California. His grandfather was Wilson, the guy that Mount Wilson is named after there. He was mayor of California, a very wealthy family. He's actually got some Hispanic ancestry in there as well. But he marries a really, really wealthy woman from Massachusetts, and that's kind of where they settle later on. But he was dyslexic, and so he had trouble with his education, and that meant he couldn't immediately get appointed to West Point, but he did so well at Virginia Military Institute that he was able to procure an appointment to West Point that way. He's a Olympic athlete. He actually gets 5th in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, Sweden. There's an argument to be made that he actually should have medaled in the event, the modern pentathlon, I think it is, or heptathlon. I always forget which one it is, but it was a shooting competition, and there were some other things too, but he was a great athlete. He ends up on John Pershing's staff in the Mexican Punitive Expedition. Pershing is engaged for a time to Patton's sister after Pershing's wife was died in a tragic fire at home. And the war kind of separates them. They don't end up getting married. But Patton goes to Europe as one of the very first American officers to go to Europe in World War I. Ends up being a tank brigade commander. He's really America's first tank commander. And so that's what gets him the opportunity then to lead an armored unit in Africa, and he ends up commanding this part of the landings of Operation Torch.
The Allied landings in French North Africa in November 1942. And then in the Anglo-American invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Though his command style, flamboyant dress, and peppery language won him many fans among the divisions he commanded and in the Allied press and public, some of his decisions and orders brought him censure from higher command. An early example was his illegal order to his army made in a public speech on the 27th of June 1943, just before the invasion of Sicily, that they should take no prisoners. Unsurprisingly, some US soldiers cold-bloodedly executed 73 Italian POWs following the capture of Biscari. 2 soldiers were placed on trial for this war crime, but Patton's order made for an uncomfortable situation for the Allies.
Now, this was something that happened a lot. And I mean, when you have the paratroopers drop behind enemy lines on D-Day, the understanding was they weren't going to be taking any prisoners, that they couldn't take prisoners. But to have a general at this level of command, an army commander, 3 stars, lieutenant general, he's the main American commander in the invasion of Sicily, saying it out loud was trouble.
To brush the entire affair under the carpet. To prevent the reputation of America's most famous general and the U.S. Army from being tarnished, the investigation of Patton was dropped by order of Patton's superior, General Omar Bradley. Patton's behavior was often only one step from a serious scandal.
Yeah, and Bradley was Patton's subordinate in Africa. He had been a corps commander under Patton there, and Patton comes in the aftermath of Kasserine Pass, which is a complete disaster for the Americans, and Friedenthal, the general, is replaced with Patton. Patton comes in and instills discipline in a matter of weeks, kind of whips them into shape and starts winning really America's first victories on the ground in World War II. So, at least in the European and African theaters, and so he immediately becomes a household name. But because of these, he couldn't play the political game. He was very politically incorrect at a time when you're trying to work with allies, and that's why somebody like Eisenhower ends up in the role that he does, because he's not only a sound strategic thinker, but he knows how to manage all of that complicated allied mess that has to be managed. Patton could have never done that. And Bradley is also very diplomatic. Bradley's not nearly the general that Patton is when it comes to tactics on the battlefield. In fact, Bradley tends to get in the way of some of Patton's success later on in France. But he knows how to play the political game, and so he's going to rise to a higher level of command. But Patton's not made for that. Patton's made to be a general commanding an army, getting stuff done.
Just a few weeks after the Biscari murders, Patton physically slapped a U.S. soldier across the face inside an evacuation hospital. The man was suffering from combat fatigue, something which Patton did not tolerate. That was on the 3rd of August 1943. But Patton again lost his cool with a soldier suffering from combat fatigue a few days later at another evacuation hospital he was visiting. When the private told Patton the reason he was there, Patton lost his temper, calling the soldier a coward and a disgrace. "You ought to be lined up against a wall and shot," shouted Patton. There were further incidents.
So Patton's a real old school guy. I mean, he comes from that line of thought that that's how you dealt with those things. And interestingly enough, Patton is really an insecure guy, and a lot of this toughness and bravado that you see from him is his recognition of the role that he has to play publicly for his soldiers and the air of confidence that he needs to instill in them, and fear at times. But if you read through his private journals and things that he wrote about, there's a lot of insecurity there, and there's a lot of self-doubt at times there, and I think he's trying to overcompensate for that sometimes.
famously towards the end of the war, when Patton ordered a task force of tanks and infantry
Bomb.
to go 50 miles behind German lines to liberate an officers' POW camp at Hammelburg in Germany. Task Force Baum, which I made a video about some time ago, link in the end screen, was a complete fiasco.
Yeah, so his son-in-law had been captured. Son-in-law ends up, I think, a 4-star general later on in life, as does his son, George S. Patton IV. I think his son-in-law had been captured in Africa a couple of years earlier, and so when he hears that the camp is within reach where his son-in-law is being kept, he very foolishly sends this task force, and a lot of them get killed.
314 men, 16 Sherman tanks and many other vehicles set out, and only 35 men and no tanks and vehicles returned, all the rest being killed or captured in March 1945. It subsequently emerged that Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters, was a prisoner at the camp. The press attention was most unwelcome to General Eisenhower and the Allied cause, and it looked as though Patton had used his power to send a half-thought-out rescue mission to rescue his daughter's husband.
And the press is a big part in all of this. The slapping incidents on Sicily, for example, probably get swept under the rug, except somebody in the press gets hold of it or witnessed it or something, and that's how the word got out, and it became a public relations nightmare back home in the States, and that forced Eisenhower to act and sideline Patton for the better part of a year.
Heedless of the cost in American lives and equipment. It was an abuse of power, but so successful was Patton's handling of his U.S. Third Army in pushing through Germany, the episode was hushed up.
Yeah, and this is a big part of it. When you are as successful as Patton was on the battlefield in 1944 and 45, you get yourself a little bit of leeway to do things that other people might not have such a long leash on. And to Eisenhower's credit, he recognized the asset that he had in Patton, even though it meant taking on a major headache for himself in allowing him to continue in that role.
Another problematic subject was Patton's increasingly antagonistic attitude to America's ally, the Soviet Union.
But was he wrong, though? I mean, I get, again, that you have to play the political game. But he wasn't wrong.
Patton did not want to stop his army at the Bavarian-Czech frontier, and
That's such an interesting video right there. You've got Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley all side by side. Fascinating.
It allows some units to push into what would be Soviet territory in April 1945. He famously said of Russians, quote, "I have no particular desire to understand them, except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them," unquote. His fellow generals and Allied leaders did not much like Patton for a variety of reasons. Some thought him overrated as a general, an accusation also levelled at another flamboyant World War II leader, British Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery.
And here's the thing, a lot has been made of the rivalry between those guys, but Patton definitely recognized Montgomery's talent and definitely believed that Montgomery was a really good general. And I don't know that I've ever read Montgomery's thoughts on Patton. I would guess he probably didn't like a lot of Patton's flamboyance, even though they were both equally that way. But a lot has been made as well about, in the movie Patton, how they portray that all the German generals think that Patton's the best commander the Americans have. And then other people have pushed back and said, well, there's no evidence of that. Well, really there is, though. There are a number of German generals who commented and wrote afterwards, even after the war, talking about how Patton was the closest thing to a kind of a blitzkrieg, a Guderian that the Allies had. He was the closest thing to a German style of general, that he would have fit in really well with their style of how they overran France, for example. So I think they did have a lot of respect for his performance on the battlefield.
Interestingly, Montgomery got on very well with Patton and admired him.
Yeah. Okay.
General Eisenhower knew Patton's value, saying after his death, quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that Patton's name struck terror at the hearts of the enemy," unquote. General Bradley, however, disliked Patton in every
Yeah, but see, the more I learn about Bradley, the more I don't like Bradley.
way possible, and General Sir Alan Brooke, the British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, called Patton, quote, a dashing, courageous, wild and unbalanced leader, good for operations requiring thrust and push, but at a loss in any operation requiring skill and judgment.
I don't know that I'd go that far, but I get his point. But that's what I was saying earlier. Patton's not a guy that you want overseeing the entire Allied advance, but you give him an army and a role, and tactically on the battlefield, he will get the job done, and he will probably do it quicker than you expect him to.
President Harry S. Truman did not rate Patton in comparison with the glowing praise heaped upon him by his predecessor, President Roosevelt. Truman compared Patton to two other egotists, General MacArthur in the Pacific and to General George Armstrong Custer, who had died at the Little Bighorn in 1876.
But I think a lot of that is Truman's personality. Truman, I don't think, liked people who had that personality type in general. The difference was, I don't think Patton was, I mean, and there is some similarities for sure between Patton and Custer. Custer was very much like Patton in his performance on the battlefield in the Civil War. It's just that Custer didn't know how to rein his ego in, whereas Patton, where his ego did get him in trouble in terms of, some of the things we've already talked about, I think he was capable of reining it in.
We could go on with all this all day. Suffice it to say that Patton had plenty of admirers and detractors in the Allied camp. But enough of the latter to wish him harm is hard to say.
I don't think so.
What is certain is that forces managed to keep Patton out of the Pacific War. As soon as Germany was defeated in early May 1945, Patton demanded a transfer to the Pacific and an army to lead.
Yeah, he doesn't want to be stuck in some occupation duty. He recognized that wasn't his role, and I think anyone in hindsight looking at Patton and his performance and the way he talked and the things that happened knew that that was just the wrong place for him.
It seems odd that so famous and capable a general as Patton was denied such a high-profile role in the last fighting in World War II. Patton...
Yeah, but they didn't really send any of those generals, like those higher-up generals from Europe, over to the Pacific.
Waiting to hear whether he would get such a command, flew home to Bedford, Massachusetts, via Paris and London, arriving on the 7th of June 1945. He spent time with his family and gave a speech before an audience of 20,000 at Hatch Memorial Shell, an outdoor concert venue in Boston. He again exhibited a gross lack of judgment, saying that a man who dies in battle is, quote, frequently a fool, unquote, which, considering the number of bereaved...
Now, the video we're watching here, I think, is from L.A., but there is video of his speech in Massachusetts, I believe. And yeah, that did happen, what he's talking about.
Mothers and wives in his audience was an appalling thing to say.
Yeah.
Patton then gave more speeches before huge audiences in Denver, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. In the meantime, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson had decided that Patton would not be sent to the Pacific Theater. Instead, he was ordered to return to Germany as military...
Yeah, that's Doolittle and Patton walking up the steps in L.A. there.
Governor of Bavaria. Bored and restless, the appointment was ill-chosen.
Yeah, it was
Patton
terrible.
viewed the denazification process that the Germans were being subjected to as not very important. He remained concerned with the Soviet menace to Europe.
I don't know if he viewed it as not important so much as I think Patton's attitude was that in order to effectively govern Bavaria, there were certain lower level people who were members of the Nazi Party that were going to have to be kept in place. I'm not saying it was right or wrong. The fact is he was wrong because he was ordered not to do that. And there was a strict denazification. They weren't allowed to use those people. And he took it upon himself to use those people anyway.
The early stages of the Cold War began to unfold in occupied Germany. In his opinion, forcibly expressed to U.S. Secretary of War Robert Patterson, the U.S. Army in Germany had to be kept at full strength, and he bitterly regretted having had to hand back territory his Third Army had liberated in Europe to the Soviets. Quote, "We have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them, but we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war." Unquote.
He was not wrong. Was it undiplomatic? Yeah, but he wasn't wrong.
Patton's attitude to the defeated Germans was another source of embarrassment to Eisenhower and Truman. He famously stated that, quote, "SS means no more in Germany than being a Democrat in America." Unquote.
Wouldn't go that far.
His private remark was published, creating another storm in the press that did his reputation absolutely no good and required sorting out.
And this is the thing, a lot of very talented people in one area are completely idiots when it comes to another. And Patton was an incredibly capable battlefield commander who should have never talked to the press, who should have never been put in a political position, an administrative role. He was a battlefield commander, and that's it.
Patton was also very vocal in his resistance to U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s plan for post-war Germany, believing that the Americans would be seen as too harsh if it were fully enacted. It wasn't helped that Patton had made many remarks that bordered on anti-Semitism, aggravating...
And he definitely was anti-Semitic. I think that's undeniable.
Certain sections of the U.S. press against him. Writing of the destruction of Berlin, which he visited in late July 1945, Patton said, quote, "Berlin gave me the blues. We have destroyed what could have been a good race, and we are about to replace them with Mongolian savages, and all Europe will be communist." Unquote.
Again, racist, but not wrong when it came to his view on the Soviets.
Patton became more and more obsessed with the Soviet threat and angry that America was, in his view, unnecessarily punishing the Germans instead of protecting Europe from the Soviets. Small wonder that some people might have preferred it if so famous a leader as Patton was silenced.
And he was in the early stages once it was decided he was going home, and he was actually right after the accident that eventually led to his death happened. He was scheduled to go home. And then again, after his accident, he died the day before he was supposed to go home. So I can see why people want to make that into something, some conspiracy that wasn't really there. He was planning on writing a book before the accident happened, and he had kept a diary and kept a lot of notes. And I think there were probably a lot of people who would have been very nervous about whatever book he wrote because it would have been incredibly popular.
Elements of the press in America, as I have said, had become rather anti-Patton, and Eisenhower relieved him of his position as military governor of Bavaria and gave him command of a paper army, the 15th in Germany. Patton took the job happily, relieved to be out of the denazification business, but his continued vocal criticisms of US policy in Germany, and of course denunciation of the Soviets, continued. Patton, four-star general, the most famous American of the war, was a massive liability to the US occupation of Germany and the government back in Washington, D.C. It has subsequently emerged that the Americans and the Soviets tapped Patton's phone, so concerned were they by his behavior and pronouncements. Concerned enough to kill him, perhaps. On the 9th of December 1945, Patton was invited by his Chief of Staff, Major General Gay, on a pheasant hunting trip near the town of Mannheim in Germany. The party consisted of two vehicles, Patton's 1938 Cadillac 75 staff car, driven by Private First Class Horace Woodring, a 19-year-old combat veteran.
So, as we get into this story of the accident and the aftermath, you have to ask yourself the question, logically speaking, if you're looking to take Patton out, is this the way you would do it? An accident that only really injures him, and it's really a freak accident that 99% of the time probably wouldn't have resulted in any serious injury?
With Patton was General Gay, and travelling ahead of the Cadillac was a jeep driven by Sergeant Joseph Scrouse, carrying the guns for the hunt, food, and a hunting dog. On the way, Patton ordered a stop at the Roman ruins at Saalburg, then resumed the journey sitting in the front passenger seat to warm his feet next to the heater as it was cold and snowy outside. At a military police checkpoint, the Cadillac stopped so that the frozen hunting dog could be transferred to Patton's car, and Patton resumed his usual right-hand back seat with Gay sitting to his left. With the Jeep leading, the Cadillac followed the N38 road to the northern outskirts of Mannheim. At a railway-level crossing, the Jeep passed over, but the Cadillac was held up by a passing train. After the train had passed, Woodring pulled away, noticing 2 U.S. Army trucks pulled onto the side of the road half a mile ahead. One started moving towards the Cadillac. The truck was a 2.5-ton 6x6 GMC.
That's what they call a deuce and a half.
And as it was about to pass the Cadillac, it suddenly veered left directly into the car's path, Woodring having no time to take evasive action. The Cadillac collided with the truck at 20 miles per hour. Patton was thrown forward into a railing behind the driver's seat, injuring his head and neck. Bleeding profusely from a laceration that extended from the bridge of his nose to the top of his scalp, Patton collapsed into Gay's lap, unable to move. Woodring flagged down the first vehicle that he saw. It turned out to be an army ambulance. The medic, Sergeant Leroy Ogden, managed to stop the bleeding, and then Patton was driven to the 130th Station Hospital at Heidelberg, arriving 1 hour after the crash.
And he knew instantly that he was paralyzed. He starts telling General Gay to work his fingers, and he realizes he can't feel anything, and he acknowledges right away. A seatbelt would have saved his life. A seatbelt would have kept him. He went forward and hit his head in just the right way to break his neck.
Military police arrived at the scene to investigate the crash. The truck's driver, Technical Sergeant 5th Class Robert Thompson, was acting rather strangely. He seemed unconcerned by the accident, grinning constantly, and Woodring felt that Thompson and 2 unnamed companions may have been under the influence of alcohol. Certainly, Thompson was 50 miles from where he was supposed to be, and on some kind of unauthorized joyride at the time of the accident. 2 officers of the 818th Military Police Company interviewed all those involved. No charges were filed against anyone. The accident considered a routine fender bender. In the hospital, Patton was found to be paralyzed from the neck down, his vertebrae severely dislocated. Specialists were flown in, as well as his wife, from America. However, about a week after the accident, Patton started to improve, some respiratory muscle movement coming back, and preparations were made to fly him to the U.S. for more treatment.
I don't know the medical details, but there's certainly a distinct possibility that he could have recovered some function below the neck. It doesn't sound like it was a complete break. Doesn't sound like they had any evidence that the spinal cord was severed. It might have just been really bad swelling and bruising, and some of that stuff, when eventually, if it recovers, could have resulted in some kind of improvement. They put these at the time. I have an uncle. He actually grew up as my older brother. We grew up in the same family. Who broke his neck as a teenager, and initially they put 2 screws in his head, and he was laying flat, and they had it went like traction across the back, and it held his head in place so he couldn't move his neck from side to side. It just held it perfectly still. And then after they did surgery, they put him in a halo where they put screws in his skull, and he wore that thing for a long time. At this time, they actually put hooks in his jaw to hold it in place rather than screwing anything into the skull. Incredibly painful. And then eventually they put him in a full cast that had him in a cast from here all the way down to his chest and held everything perfectly in place.
But on the 20th of December 1945, Patton suddenly deteriorated again, and the next day he died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. On the 24th...
So it was a blood clot that went through his body, and I think ended up in his lungs. It's a common complication. So it wasn't directly because of the accident. It was one of the complications of his recovery.
Of December 1945, as per his wishes, he was buried among the 3rd Army's fallen at the U.S. cemetery at Ham in Luxembourg.
I don't know if he had specific wishes on that. And initially the plan was his wife wanted to take him home to Massachusetts to be buried. And I've been to his house. I think it's in Hamilton, Massachusetts, not far from Boston. Really, really cool site to visit, that house there. But in talking it over with some of the, because she was there in Germany at the hospital, and in talking it over, they decided to have him buried. And he wasn't initially buried where he is today, which is kind of up at the top of the cemetery. When you go there, his grave's all by itself and fenced off, or chained off. He was originally right in the middle of the cemetery, and what happened was so many people were visiting the grave that they eventually had to move him, and then they moved him again.
So what about the conspiracy to kill Patton? Well, in actual fact, nothing whatsoever was said about a conspiracy for 30 years following Patton's death. Such a notion only surfaced in 1974 with the publication of a novel called The Algonquin Project by British writer Frederick Nolan. The book was a fictional story loosely set against the real death of Patton.
But this is how those things get started. And then by the time that generations have repeated it, you get to today, and people don't realize the origin of this conspiracy theory. They look back to the time and say, oh yeah, it makes sense. Well, nobody thought that at that time.
Dealing with a murder plot to kill a famous general. It became a rather bad film called Brass Target in 1978. And from these two fictions grew the conspiracy theory of Patton's assassination. In 1979, a cash-strapped former World War II OSS operative named Douglas Bazata came out of the woodwork with a fabricated story, believed by many, that he had been asked by OSS Director Major General William Donovan to...
And OSS is the predecessor of the modern CIA.
Kill Patton.
Office of Strategic Services.
In December 1945, to shut him up as he had become an embarrassment to the US authorities. On the surface, Bazata, who'd earned a hatful of high decorations for his World War II daring do, looked impressive, but any cursory comparison of the events of Patton's last day, as recorded by General Gay, Patton's driver Woodring, and numerous other witnesses, is at variance with Bazata's rather ridiculous story.
And this is where, again, we've talked about this before. You look at the primary sources, you look at the people who were there, who were involved in it. What did they say at the time? What did they say for years afterwards? Versus some guy 30 years later who's never been connected to these events, who suddenly comes out and says, yeah, here's what happened. Here's what really happened.
Basically, Bazata claimed to have jammed the window beside Patton open 4 inches when the general was touring the Roman ruins shortly before his accident, so that he could shoot him later, just before the crash, using a special rock-firing gun made by a country he couldn't remember that would look like Patton had suffered a non-gunshot wound to the head caused by the crash, which was also, of course, staged. When Patton survived the shooting and the crash, he was finished off in hospital with poison that emulated natural death. The press lapped up Bazata's fictional story, merging it with the novel and film that stated the rumors of an assassination plot. What also fueled the mystery was the fact that no autopsy was performed on Patton, so no poison could be discovered.
Right.
Well, of course, as it was considered a routine accident and not a murder case, no autopsy was necessary.
Yeah.
Also, records pertaining to Patton's accident would be revealed to be missing from the National Archives. These points found their way into Patton's biographer Ladislas Farrago's 1981 book, The Last Days of Patton. Since then, 3 more books have been published elaborating on the alleged plot to murder Patton, as well as introducing a new theory that he was murdered by the Soviet NKVD,
that's the one I've always heard.
forerunner to the KGB. However, no concrete evidence that disagrees with the original witness statements has been produced, but the notion that Patton was assassinated has nonetheless entered the American national consciousness, fueled, of course, by the Internet. In the final analysis, it seems likely that George S. Patton died because of a chain of unfortunate circumstances, rather than some complex conspiracy.
And this is, again, one of those examples of someone as larger than life as Patton, someone who was so vital to some major events in world history. People don't want to believe that they could have died in a freak accident and then complications afterwards when it seemed like they were starting to recover. We don't want that to be how life goes, but that is how life goes, unfortunately. We'd rather believe that there was some grand conspiracy to take down such a man as that. Same thing with JFK.
He was just unlucky. When great people die in such ordinary ways, people often reach for the fantastic because they can't accept the mundane.
100%.
The Conspiracy to Kill Patton is merely a fictional book and movie plot that has taken on a life of its own. Until some real evidence of foul play is presented, Patton's death must remain what it was, an accident.
Yep.
Thanks for watching.
All right, so that was my first time doing a reaction to one of his videos, Mark Felton. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was well done, well researched. It's good information, laid out in a way that makes a lot of sense. Let me know your thoughts. Is there another one of his videos that you think I should check out at some point? And we'll do that. Thanks for watching.